Okay, well, thank you everyone for being here. Welcome to the Ad Hoc Committee on Police Policy's first subcommittee on the use of force. We are meeting virtually because of Governor Kate Brown's Stay Home, Save Lives executive order. And before we start, I would like to remind everyone that we had a high-profile use of force incident last week and that there is an investigation ongoing. So whilst there may be issues that are pertinent to that case that come up in the course of this meeting, please avoid talking about the specifics and getting drawn into those details. So with that, I'm going to talk everyone through the proposed way forward that we have, which is based on what we put together in the committee last time we met. So first of all, there are the group agreements. Can everyone see this? Okay. So first of all, the group agreements maintain awareness of our power differentials, community members get priority, although I don't believe we have any councillors in this meeting. Share time, contribute proportionally, share your own experience, default to confidentiality with others' experiences, listen actively and fully, avoid generalizing and assumptions, remember intent and impact of your words matter, value dissenting opinions, maintain the goal of dialogue rather than debate, be curious, practice accountability, and limit the use of the chat box to procedural and informational items only. We'll give every member 3 minutes in total to speak in every round. And we're asking that if you have anything further to say, please wait until everybody else who wishes to speak on the subject has done so before you come in for your second round. Kevin, are you okay to do the timekeeping on that?
I am,
Excellent.
yes.
So the first thing, as you will recall, we had city councillors ask us to use this 3-question format to help them to understand the intent of any recommendations that come forward. And I will keep referring members of the committee back to these 3 questions as we're engaged in our deliberations. What is the issue the community is experiencing, and which communities in Eugene experience that problem most strongly? What specifically and clearly is the recommended change, which would be the motion? And how do you think that recommended change will achieve the desired result? So in terms of how we intend to proceed, what the committee needs to achieve today is to identify issues contained in 21st Century Policing and Campaign Zero that you wish to discuss, and then identify the EPD policies that correspond with those policy issues. After that, we can discuss the potential changes and additions to EPD policy and agree topic areas for motions to be drafted, as well as designating committee members to draft those motions. So hopefully that much is clear. Essentially, we don't want to get too far into detail in this meeting. We want to give people the time to be able to have the discussion rather than be drafting motions as we go, because that takes up the valuable time that the committee has. Once this meeting is over, members can draft motions, and staff, including myself and Kevin, members of the EPD policy staff, will be available to assist in drafting those motions. And if we'll ask for those to be returned in advance of the second subcommittee meeting, they'll then be shared out amongst everyone. And then finally, at the second meeting, the motions will be presented and the detail will be discussed, again, to avoid us drafting things on the fly. And then finally, we'll vote on all of those motions and bring them forward to the full committee. So with that, I will stop sharing and ask members what it is that they wish to start by discussing.
Silverio has mentioned something in the chat box that he would like to briefly, he'd like the credentials on this from the subject matter expert. So the 3 folks from EPD tonight, just a brief introduction, I think.
Sure. Okay, so should we start with Chief Skinner then?
Sure, happy to. Hello all, my name is Chris Skinner. I'm the chief of police in Eugene. You guys for the opportunity just to at least sit in. Certainly happy to offer any value around input, but guessing that I'm going to do a lot of listening tonight, which is always good for a chief to spend some time listening. Just as a way of background, this is finishing my 30th year in law enforcement, and have been a part of 4 different law enforcement agencies in both Oregon and Washington, and have been a chief of police for almost 10 years now in 2 separate agencies.
Okay, and then if we can move on to Cindy.
Hello, Cindy Coleman. I am the Professional Standards Manager at the EPD, and I've been with the department over 25 years and been in internal affairs for almost 20. I have lived in this community since 1976. So I went to school here, and Eugene has been a big part of my life.
And then Sergeant Maloney.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Sergeant Maloney. I've met most of you already, I think. So when it comes to my law enforcement experience and where I come from with this, I've been in law enforcement for approximately 18 years. I worked in the jail first at the county, and then I came to Eugene about 16 years ago. And what I've done since I've been with Eugene and what I did at the county, I've been involved in use of force, policy review, policy development, as well as curriculum, training, instruction, from instructing all the way to supervising instructors and still instructing for approximately 14, 15 years.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I think we're ready to start diving into the meat of things. And if members of the committee want to come forward with any of the particular issues that they would like to ensure are discussed over the course of this meeting, or if they have any testimony that they would like to give, we'll give 3 minutes for testimony before we dive into the meat of things. Marty?
Yeah, so I kind of took a different approach on this, and I turned it on its head and went through the EPD policy that was forwarded to us and kind of kept the Campaign Zero 21st Century framework as a lens as I read through those. So independently, I came up with like around a dozen different policy proposals that I'd like to address. And I don't feel like it's the best way for me to just submit that independent of the rest of you all here, independent of your input and contributions, and then have, you know, a bunch of different competing uninformed pieces of information between the 6 or 7 of us. So I had submitted that to the facilitation team a while back and asked them to share it with you so you all could look over it and give me your feedback, and we could add our ideas and share them together. Another thing that I inquired about was putting together some sort of a working document that we could contribute to collectively, and there are legal hurdles to doing that. So I think the best would be if we could submit a single document to Kaz that he could share with everyone, and everyone could work off of and send their drafts back to Kaz. So also in response to the last meeting, I built a spreadsheet that is like Kaz's, except instead of 21st century policing, it's got EPD policy, and then it's got a column for how is this affecting the community? What do you propose changes? How does that, you know, address the change? So if people want to spend time here talking about testimony and how your community is affected, so be it. But I feel like there's massive amounts of policies and proposals that we could be making, and I'd like a real efficient way of doing that.
Sure. Thanks for that, Marty. And you have reminded me that I did not, in fact, share that document, so my apologies for that. I'll ensure that it's shared after this meeting. In terms of, and the invitation to give testimony was a matter of courtesy, because in previous meetings, members have expressed the desire to raise a particular issue that they've had experience of, or that others they know have had experience of. It doesn't appear to be the case within this group. So again, I'd like to ask members which particular policy areas they would like to raise, particularly in reference to the documents that were circulated last week and again today as part of the packet for this meeting. I have those documents before me, so I can share them if you wish. But I'm very much reliant on the committee members coming forward with their ideas, their proposals, and their discussion items. So if anybody else has any discussion items that they would like to bring forward, please do so. We'll make a note. Sorry, go ahead, Silva.
Yeah, so I raised my hand in the participant box, but I did want to ask if you could share that file with us, if we could look at some of those different policy pieces that Marty had mentioned. And I want to get a clear understanding. It seemed that we were being told that certain policies that are already being looked at by the police commission are not topics that we could touch upon. That was kind of the indication that I got.
Sorry, I don't understand.
With use of pepper balls and the spray,
yeah,
and the tear gas. Those are policies that the EPD is currently at the police commission level looking at. And so the notation on the guidelines that we were given made it feel as though we were not to talk about those particular subjects.
That was not the intent. The intent was simply to let people know that those documents are being looked at by other bodies. The ad hoc committee has a broad purview, and much of what it's doing is cuts across the work of other bodies, the Human Rights Commission, etc. So those items are all up for discussion in this meeting. But it was simply a point of information so that members were aware of the fact that there are other forums in which these are also being discussed.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So once again, referring to the document in question, would you like me to pull it up? The grid that I shared last week and again this afternoon, or would members like to volunteer any specific areas that they would like to talk about? Rick? You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, I was hoping that, you know, with the subject of use of force in itself is pretty broad. And what I was looking forward to hearing would be specific complaints, and maybe included would be frequency, so that we can get an idea of what you really need to focus on.
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure that I follow. That you want to know about the number of complaints that are made about a specific policy area?
No. Okay, we're talking about use of force. That's what this is all about.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but use of force in itself is very broad. There are a lot of different topics, as I could see. Well, I know anyway. But when you initially sent out some of the data and everything, there were tons of them. Some of them were repetitive, but I was under the assumption that there had to be at least a few that were pretty specific as to why we're having a subcommittee on use of force. And I know it's a very serious topic all over the country. So for purposes of Eugene Police Department, I was hoping to possibly have individuals narrow it down as to, some specific, I don't know if it's techniques or subjects that has really been brought to the attention of the department by the public, by the citizens.
Well, I mean, I'll let Chief Skinner chime in a moment, but the approach that we've taken throughout is to give the committee that power, in the sense that we don't want to make decisions on what you should or should not be looking at. The purview that was given by council was to use 21st century policing and Campaign Zero as our basis. And on that basis, I put together the grid, which was circulated to committee members. And it is really up to committee members to engage in the process of deciding which items on that grid they wish to focus on in this meeting and then bring forward as motions. So I think perhaps the most straightforward way of proceeding, seeing as nobody has volunteered any specific items they'd like to look. Sorry, Silveria, go ahead.
Sorry, I do have a number of issues and things that I'd like to kind of bring up and discuss. I'm just allowing for other people to kind of step in.
Sure.
One thing that I think is very important, and I think that kind of gets lost in all the use of force language, is the use of the spit hoods. And I think that's something that we can easily just kind of have a conversation with the chief and the other experts here and ask if there is any sort of not notification, but a requirement that when a spit hood is used, that be cataloged. I know that that's the case with tasers, so I was wondering if we can do that.
Okay, we can absolutely have that discussion. I will continue to go around. I can see that Guadalupe has her hand up.
Yeah, a couple of things when I looked at the documents you sent. Part of it for me is the use of the taser. And the reason I'm raising that is just because what I hear from folks and what I myself ask all the time when we hear stuff about what has happened to somebody in relation to being either killed or injured by the police is, what is the point of having tasers if the first response is to shoot somebody? And unfortunately, as we're hearing even today about folks, about how public safety is responding to individuals, it feels as though the tasers are not considered, and quickly it feels as though somebody gets shot and killed or injured rather than using the taser. So when I was looking at that, I thought, okay, so what's the point of the tasers if the first thing you're going to do is shoot somebody? The other piece that I would like to at least, find more about, the issue of de-escalation. I'm just curious about, because when I looked at the information you sent, there's different categories like mental health, disabilities, and other areas like that. And I'm kind of curious as to what kind of training or what kind of background or information would an officer have that would make him able to understand a mental health issue or a disability or other issues that would make somebody more dangerous to interact with. Like, how do they know how to, like, are they counselors? Do they understand what that looks like? Why somebody would respond if they have mental health issues or disabilities? So I'm also curious about, or wondering about, the area of de-escalation by public safety, and what does that look like, and how do they see it?
So just to recap, then we have Silveria wants to discuss spit hoods. Guadalupe wants to discuss the use of tasers and de-escalation. Is there anybody else that has an issue they'd like to bring forward? And then we'll just run through them. And I'm sure that will jog people's memories and their minds as well. So once we've been through this particular tranche of things, we'll move on to the next one. Marty, I saw your hand.
So yeah, if you could share that document in some way, that would be wonderful. I'm just trying to skim through it. Some of the things that I had proposed in there, a lot was focused on de-escalation and tightening up that policy. It seems like it needs a lot of help to me. And there were some things in here about requiring more about what was the word for it? Hold on, I'm getting lost in here. Duty to intercede. And in terms of deadly force, I wanted to add some things like an officer shall not use deadly force to apprehend a person who is suspected of a minor or nonviolent offense. And then in terms of actions following deadly force, requiring drug testing. And I'll save the rest for the follow-up in between our meetings.
Okay, if you could email Kevin that document, because I'm facilitating the group, then Kevin will be able to share it with the subcommittee members.
Yeah.
So I think then we'll turn to the elements that have been raised, starting with Silverio's discussion on spit hoods. So if you'd like to speak to that for a couple of minutes, Silverio, what your particular concerns are.
Yeah, so as I understand it, I know that there's different guidelines that we have in place for the taser, and I want to know what sort of guidelines that we have for the use of the spit hood, when it's deployed, how many warnings are given before it's deployed, is it ever used in a situation where it's more of a not necessary, but as a way to sort of control a subject. And it feels to me as though it's one of those last, like a last, what is the term that I'm looking for? Last use.
Last resort?
Last resort use, yes. But it just feels to me as though it's very, not just primitive, but not, dangerous and demeaning, and it feels as though it breaks some sort of a human rights violation. So,
sure. I'd like to give the opportunity to the chief to respond to that. And as I noted them down, the specific questions are: what are the guidelines for its use? When is it deployed? And what warnings are given?
So I'm going to have to lean on Ryan Maloney for some of this. Silver, my guess is that you grabbed a fairly obscure that most are going to have at the ready, much like taser or pepper ball or some of the stuff that's happening. And so I can't speak specifically to the policy language, but I think Ryan maybe will give us a better sense of what we do in the field and under what circumstances that would be appropriate. And my guess is that there are some threshold things that happen in the field with a subject that would leave an officer believing that it would be an appropriate use as somebody's transported between point A and point B. So Ryan, do you have any background or any sense of training or what we're telling troops around the use of any kind of, whether it's called a spit hood or what we're doing to kind of contain those bodily fluids and biohazard when we're engaged with a subject?
Yeah, so to kind of explain it a little bit in detail, we have a policy that surrounds it as to when it should be deployed and when it shouldn't be deployed. Like most policies, that they're not 100% like A, B, and C have to be met, because when it comes to force and it comes to using things like this, it has to be illustrated with the totality of circumstances. So the spit hoods are 100% discussed in training as not a punitive measure. We discuss it on every single level of force, any sort of implementation or tool or anything that we use. That's one of the pillars of what we discuss, is that we don't do anything for punitive reasons, right? It's not, that's not the intention. It's not okay. And our duty to intercede, that's in our general use force policy, it requires other officers or anybody on scene that sees something like that they think might be the case, that they automatically intercede and resolve that problem. So hopefully that kind of discusses one of your questions to it. The other one is, so it's looked at being deployed when we have a multitude of issues. So what I'll do is I'll give you an example. So we go to a subject who is very upset. They've been in a fight, or they've been in some sort of altercation, let's say at one of the local bars at Friday, Saturday night. It happens quite a bit. We get there, they're mad, they don't want to see us. We're trying to figure out what's going on. They end up being arrested for assault, or we have an attempt to arrest them for assault. They have a bloody nose because they got in that altercation, or they're spitting. They'll suck in loogies and then threaten to spit at officers, or they'll be flinging their hair around, or yelling continuously and spitting blood out of their mouth, or any of their saliva, that kind of stuff. And as officers, we can't just not deal with that, right? So we have to engage them. And so when it comes down to it, if they'll be given warnings, they'll be given opportunities, like, you need to stop doing that. You need to, take a breath, stop yelling, try not to spit, or I'll be forced to put a hood over your mouth so that we can stop that from basically interjecting into officers' eyes, mouths, or any citizens like that. As far as the actual spit hood to it, you can see through it. It's mesh, and it's set and adjusted per person for their height so that it covers their nose and mouth. And to be honest with you, at this day and age, with everybody wearing masks, it's pretty much exactly the same, except they have a mesh over their eyes and they can't take it off. But you can breathe through it, you can talk through it, you can see through it, you can do all the above. We've all had them deployed on us in training, and they're used on the street every now and then, especially if it's going to prevent any sort of biohazard, or if we have any history with the subject that we know that they're positive for other medical issues like Hep C, all that kind of stuff. So I think I spoke to a few of those questions. Kaz, can you remind me what the other?
Yeah, so the last one you kind of touched on it was what warnings are given, and I guess the question there is there a specific, we're going to put a spit hood on you unless you stop warning?
Yeah, in essence, there's not like a set policy of how we go about it, but there's always when opportunity allows itself, we're definitely going to give somebody the opportunity to stop what they're doing so that they can comply, so that we can go about our business and treat everybody with the most humane and respect that we can. But the situation still has to be resolved, and safety has to be paramount in those situations.
So my main concern or question is it mandatory reporting?
Well, the policy doesn't directly, as far as the spit hood policy, doesn't mandate it. But use of force reporting, the general use of force, it says that we will document that. So it'll be documented not only on the video cameras that they wear, typically dash cameras that they wear. It'll be stated over the radio that a spit hood was applied, when it was applied, and when it's removed and they get to the jail. It'll also be stated whether or not it's removed. Most of the time when they get there, if they're still really active, the jail staff then determines when that comes off. We don't, because that's a transition of custody, and it's in their facility.
As I read the policy, it does, the language doesn't make it makes it feel as though it is a mandatory reporting. So is that something that we can clear up? Can we make it mandatory reporting if a spit hood's used?
Well, it's definitely up for discussion. I don't think there's any issue with that. It's taught as a mandatory thing. Anytime we use anything like that, it's taught that we timestamp it basically over the radio communications, when it was placed on, when it was taken off, if it was taken off, and it's written in their report as far as their force, when it was placed on, why it was placed on, justification for it, and whether or not it was removed by us.
And is that data, is it something that can be shared or compiled, and we would be able to kind of get a sense of how often that's been utilized?
Right now, we don't have it as a tracked use of force. So we don't really have that necessarily. That would be something we'd have to go through each individual report and find out when we use it and when we have it. There might be a way to search it through the CAD system, but I honestly don't know.
Okay. Silverio, has that covered everything you were interested in discussing with regards to spit hoods?
Yeah, so specifically, I'd like to make it so that we would have some better language regarding mandatory reporting for the spit hood use. And this is just baseline. I mean, this was something that was, you know, it's there, and it's there are a number of other things that I want to hit on topics, but you know, if we can get it a mandatory sort of reporting on that, and just sort of data that's compiled on when it's used, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll make a note of that as one of the actions resulting from the committee to make a motion regarding mandatory reporting of the use of spit.
One other concern that I had, it does say that a person that was recently sprayed with the oleariocin capsaicin aerosol is not to be fitted with a hood, and if that can be something that we are just given clear guidelines that that's not going to be the case with somebody who's been recently sprayed with that aerosol.
Okay.
So sorry, so what were you saying about the policy as far as you can't put it on?
So it says in the policy, although it does preclude the prevent the use of a spit hood, extra monitoring should be provided to persons who are mentally unstable, elderly, or very young, extremely intoxicated, or have excessive bleeding from the face or head, or those who have been very recently sprayed with oleariocin capsaicin aerosol.
Yeah, so I can kind of talk to that a little bit. It's what it's saying is that it's not a you cannot do that, but if you do end up putting a spit hood on somebody that's been sprayed with OC spray, they definitely have to be right there with them, and they require much more supervision because OC spray as it is, if it's effective, causes some anxiety stuff, and so there's already visibility issues, and with somebody handcuffed, it adds more anxiety to it. So you do also need to understand that when somebody's been sprayed with OC spray, I don't know how familiar you're with it, but it causes basically all the mucous membranes to become inflamed, and then your eyes tear up, they burn, you get snot running out of your head from years ago, everything. And so when it comes to the biohazard to it, it ups the game. So if they were already pretty belligerent and that kind of stuff and spitting everything, it makes it even more of a biohazard threat. So it's not uncommon for the spit hood to be placed in those situations. But what that means is that they're going to require somebody to be right with them the entire time. And typically you'll see all officers, myself included, if that situation happens, you end up talking somebody through the situation so that they don't panic or they freak out, and it actually ends up resolving it much faster.
So my concern is people that have like asthma or have lung issues. You know, I know that would add to the anxiety of somebody who's recently been sprayed. If they have an asthma attack, if they're dealing with some sort of, breathing issue, how is that going to affect them?
Well, it'll obviously affect them a little more than somebody that doesn't have that. But that's why we immediately call medical staff. Medical staff shows up and they stay under our supervision the entire time. And if there's something that inhibits that breathing even more to where they start actually having that issue breathing, that kind of stuff, it's not uncommon for us to remove it. We can remove the spit hood just as fast as we put it on. It's not a mandate that it stays on. So it all comes down to whether or not there's a risk to the officers and the citizens that are around at the time spit hood is used. So.
Okay, so unless anyone else has any other comments, we'll move on to Guadalupe's first issue, which is around the use of tasers. Guadalupe, sorry, Marty, did you want to talk about spit hoods still? No. Okay, sorry, Guadalupe. Go ahead, and if you want to raise your concerns, your questions.
Yeah, I think part of it for me is, if I remember correctly, and maybe the chief can say, how long has it been since the EPD started using or got the tasers? I know they haven't had them forever. remember a while back, who knows when, back in the day, I guess I can say, when the conversations came up in the community about the police department wanting to buy tasers or use tasers or bring them into the department. And what I remember in some of those meetings, or at least the conversation, is the idea of having the tasers. Obviously, we were all concerned because for us, it feels like another weapon. But the idea of having the taser was to avoid using, first and foremost, any kind of deadly force like shooting somebody or using a gun. And so I don't know how the department now uses the tasers. Is that because it feels like, and I don't want to think of the EPD and the bigger picture of what we all hear across this country about what's happening, but here locally, I'm curious and wonder if and how the tasers are used. Is that really something that people decide or are trained to do first and foremost, or is it grab your gun and shoot, or is it both? So I'm kind of confused about how that has turned out, because it seems to me that what we hear more is not using the tasers, but using more the weapon that would kill or injure somebody in a very different way. So I want to know the clarification of what does EPD look like in relation to its training and its using the tasers. Is it different than the past? Is it something that you have sort of tweaked a bit considering where you started and where you're at today? I'm just kind of wondering.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, good to see you. It seems like forever seeing you, Guadalupe. Second of all, tasers have been a part of law enforcement industry practice for a lot of years, and I'm not going to be able to give you the exact number or not the exact date. Timer myself, having just come up, getting close to my 3-year mark here, but from a law enforcement perspective, the concept of tasers and the technology has been around for a long time. And as you can imagine, that technology has evolved from the very first taser that's been well over a decade ago that has been put into service. And the taser is what we call a technology and is designed to give an alternative.
Sorry to interrupt you, Chief Skinner. Your connection's quite poor. Can I suggest you turn off your camera to see if that improves your sound quality somewhat?
All right, how's that now?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks, Kez. So the taser is a less lethal technology that is designed to be an alternative when that alternative is appropriate to other forms of force and force that's higher level than the taser. So as you can imagine, from the moment we got tasers in law enforcement to this point, it's been kind of an iterative process that as we have gotten better technology, better trained, and quite frankly, as case law has come out throughout the country, and maybe more importantly through the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, that addresses certain cases where tasers were used, or in some cases where tasers weren't used and people felt like they should have been used. EPD has gone through a significant policy rewrite and scrutiny through the police commission. I think taser is one of the most comprehensive policies I've ever seen. And it's multiple pages that the police commission informed us on, and we continue to adjust that where appropriate around our taser usage. Keep in mind that force options on the West Coast are all governed by the Graham factors out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which basically requires us to identify force options based on a totality of circumstances, and there's a bunch of those different Graham factors that are taken into consideration as to whether or not the force was reasonable or not. But in most cases, a taser is a viable option, and in a few cases, because of the dynamic nature of the situation or the immediate threat to officers, that utilizing a taser before deadly force puts officers in a detrimental position or in a deadly position. And so what the Graham factors allows for it to happen, and this is one of the things that is interesting across the country, that the West Coast is pretty unique on, is that there's not like this ladder that you have to hit every rung as you move up. It allows you to, for lack of a better way to articulate this, jump rungs of the ladder based on the totality of the circumstances. And every once in a while you run into a situation where the immediacy and the dynamics of the situation an officer gets himself into dictate a path that our force response to that resistance that bypasses TASE or OC spray or control hold or baton strikes or those types of things, and lands kind of in the lethal force realm. So it really is kind of a case-by-case analysis that occurs when we think about those force options. And again, a very, very detailed approach and look at our TASER policy that often gets looked at and tweaked. The one thing I'll leave you with as I'm wrapping up here is, culturally speaking, we have a lot of situations that are resolved with the TASER that the public doesn't generally hear about, even though we may put some information out. We actually resolve a lot of things that otherwise 30 years ago when I started this in this profession, you didn't have a lot of options. And that's where you saw a lot of police shootings, because there just wasn't the technology options. We do have a lot of situations that we resolve safely with the TASER. And maybe even more importantly, situations that we resolve not even using the TASER, but having that as an option for us and having a subject understand that it's an option, and gaining compliance that way without even having to use force. It's kind of like people showing up, like a dog handler or a canine officer showing up and he's got a dog sitting next to him, and people's inherent response is, okay, I don't want to make the dog mad, so I'm going to do what you want me to say, or I'm going to do what you want me to do. There's a lot of compliance that we can gain without even using the actual tool. And so we try to, where at all possible, get that compliance at the lowest level.
Thank you, Chief Skinner. Marty, you've got your hand up, but before you speak, I just want to check Guadalupe. I think all of your questions were covered. When were they put in place? How are they used? And how's that use changed over time? So Marty, go ahead.
So now I do want to chime in sort of from the testimony angle and just comment that as we go through these policies, it's not about, for me, is this a good policy? Is this a bad policy? It's about addressing the voice that I've heard from community members saying that they feel like there has been an abuse of use of force, that there are ways, and some of it is just like by driving by. So in some areas of town, they feel like the police are driving by a lot, and they feel like they're being watched a lot. They feel like they're being stopped a lot and asked, what are you doing here? And that builds up over time and starts to feel like intimidation. So it could even start to feel like harassment. So what I'm doing as I keep that lens, as I'm looking through the policy, is thinking, how can we make the policy prevent people from abusing the policy, circumventing it, or using it in ways that it's not meant to be, like using a spit hood because somebody's being unruly. So how can you write it in a way that's going to dissuade sworn officers from taking advantage of those things? So that's all. Oh, and I also wanted to comment that when we did the survey way back in the beginning and asked people to chime in what they thought was important, the number one item on Kaz's spreadsheet that was ranked way above everything else was the one that said ban all chokeholds, restraints, arm bars, etc. So in some cases, I don't know where I can pin it down to a specific EPD policy that's existing, but that I would want the committee to be able to say to City Council, we think this should be done. For example, we think these things should all be banned, as we said that it already is with the carotid restraint.
I mean, the committee is absolutely empowered to put forward those recommendations through the subcommittee process. I think the specific issue with the carotid restraints, that came up quite a lot. And I believe that's been addressed to the satisfaction of committee members. But absolutely, if there's anything you would like me to add to the list of actions for the committee in terms of things that should be looked at, either to be banned or for things to be worded in such a way, as you use the example of the spit hoods, to dissuade their use as a punitive measure, I will absolutely be very happy to make a note of that and to circulate it after this meeting. It may well be that some of those things are de facto banned, and Sergeant Maloney will be able to speak to that, because the circumstances that would enable them to be deployed, as with the carotid restraints, are extremely unlikely to show up, and they're not trained for by EPD. But Sergeant Maloney, if you want to speak to that.
And I already did reach out to Cindy Coleman, and she gave me some information earlier. What I'm suggesting would be something like adding to certain policies a line that says failure to XYZ would result in an allegation of misconduct, so that it's laid out right there that an officer should not ignore this or should follow through in a certain way to avoid that classifying as misconduct.
Okay, I've made a note of that, and I'll include it in the documents that are sent out after this meeting. Are there any particular areas, Marty, where you would like to see that applied, or would you like it applied as a kind of general algorithm to the use of force policies?
I suggested it in several policies in the document that is going around. That and a change of language from believes to perceives when it comes to how an officer determines when use of force is necessary. And it seems like wordsmithing, but it makes a huge difference to me, because people can come with preconceived beliefs, and I don't want that to play into their decision. You know, if somebody has implicit bias around someone because of their skin color, that should not play at all into their decision of whether or not use of force is merited. And just that simple word, perception, has to be based on something that you see or some information that you've been given, and that if you just leave it at the officer believed there was a threat, the officer believed that they were in danger, there's no way to contest that. But if you say the officer perceived it based on, they put their hand in their pocket, then the body cams should back that up. You should be able to have some way to substantiate that. Or if they say, I got this information from so-and-so, you should be able to ask so-and-so, did you give them that information? And I feel like that's a way to help prevent corruption, prevent profiling.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. I suspect that there's probably a legal definition of the word believe, and possibly for perceive as well. And I've made a note to ask the city attorney on that. And we'll make sure that that's circulated before the next meeting. I saw another hand, but I'm afraid I can't recall who had their hand up.
It was me. Yeah, I think I let it be known to you and the leadership and to the or to the committee as a whole that I do definitely want to look at the use of chokeholds, arm bars, and any sort of restraint in that manner. So that is definitely something that I want us to discuss. I know we're having a police commission meeting that we had asked formerly Sergeant Kyle. What was Kyle's last name?
Williams.
Yeah. Okay. I see. Yeah. I knew that. He's going to bring back some languages, as I understood it, to sort of look at the use of the bands of the chokeholds. So that's one of the reasons I hadn't brought it up. But I definitely feel that if that's not addressed, that's something that I'd like to see this ad hoc committee address.
Yep. Rick, go ahead.
I have a question for either Chief Skinner or Ryan, either one. Is there and I'm not playing devil's advocate, but I think this is something that may need to be elaborated on or explained to the committee and community members. Is there a provision in any way for the use of any of these banned techniques like a chokehold in certain situations? And I'll just leave it open to you, and if you can answer that, because I think that might help clarify some things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm going to try and talk video on that group. It's just a white silhouette on there. So Taz, let me know if it's just not working.
It's pretty bad, Chief. I'm sorry to say.
Is it? Golly. Yeah. You know what? All right, I'll turn it off, and then I may leave you guys for a little bit and then jump on to Wi-Fi and see if that's better as we move forward. So Rick, yeah, so one of the things that is probably part of the discussion and an interesting discussion is the perception of the word banned. When you ban something in the police department, that means that it forevermore doesn't exist and that you're not allowed to use it under any circumstance. And the use of that, regardless of the circumstance, would leave you subject to disciplinary action. So when we ban things in the police world, it basically is not at your disposal, regardless of the situation. I think we have to be a little bit careful, because when we start banning certain things, for instance, if a chokehold is banned, or the ability to when an officer is in his or her fight for her life, and the arm slips around the neck in an effort to try and end that deadly confrontation, is that a ban technique? And are we saying then that if that's the only alternative, that they should ban it and go ahead and just respond to the danger or the potential serious physical death that may happen as a result of that fight that they have? And that's a conversation we need to have, whether we feel like that's an appropriate use of that particular, I'm not even going to call it, it doesn't need to prove technique. For me, it's no different than oftentimes a flashlight to a head, the running over with a patrol car. I mean, all of these things have happened in the law enforcement world as a response to somebody's level of resistance or the perception of imminent serious physical injury or death to the officer, that they have a lot of things at their disposal that aren't technically trained on, that could be justified in their use, much like you in the privacy of your own home. If you're protecting yourself, you have a lot of things at your disposal. Is recognized that carotid restraint should not exist policy as an approved technique. For years, it was in that area where it was not considered lethal force, that it was considered a lower level of force. And when applied incorrectly, it can be detrimental. Obviously, we've seen that can be detrimental and can result in the death of the individual when that was not what the intent was. And so what we've done is we've recognized that we don't train on it adequately enough, and it's not a type of technique we want to have in our curriculum. But say technically we've completely banned it, I think is not completely, we haven't completely gone to that extent where we've put out a directive saying, regardless of the situation, regardless of how much peril you might be in it as an officer, you are absolutely not allowed to put your arm around somebody's neck. And even in your own physical, we have not taken it to that extent.
Chief, I think you will need to hop off and hop back on again, because whilst most of that came through, I think enough for us all to be able to understand, the connection was not brilliant.
And I do want to allow for a clear response from Chief, and I know he knows that I've been on this case for a while. But if I could leave with, before he does jump off, leave him with one question. We're not training on the use of chokeholds. We've already banned the use of the carotid. And the only thing that I feel at this point is sort of tripping up point is just the use of the language. And you know, I really feel as though we can get over that hurdle, but there are several other departments across the nation that have said use of chokeholds are banned, or suspended the use of chokeholds, or no longer use the chokehold as a standard. In any of the situations that you've described, I know as a citizen who does not have a personal firearm, that at the end of the day, that officer has the baton, the firearm, the taser, and those things, as you mentioned, the dog, are points that me as a person who has any interaction with any police department or any police officer or any law enforcement officer always has in the back of my mind. I'm not going to go through any sort of quick movements. I will always have direct eye contact with the person. These are things that I was personally trained on, learned as a person of color growing up in Los Angeles, under the LAPD, as a person that was held to that accountability factor for myself, because I know that I don't have that capability to use any of those weapons that I mentioned, any of that use, and that's a tiered system that I felt that I was put under. Just being a person of color as a child growing up in Los Angeles, that was a tiered system that the police department wasn't there to protect and serve me, that they were there to sort of corral me. And you know, I would like for us to get past that language of this halting danger. The use of the word ban is something that we're not gonna use, because I think at this point, if we're already not training on the use
Silverio, sorry, 30 seconds.
Got it. There you go. It's my first time you've had to stop me. If we're not training on it, if we're not using it, we're not utilizing it, and we've seen other departments do it. If that is something that we as a commission and as the police department could move to move forward, I think that'd be a great. I'm sorry. You know, it would look as though the department is actually working with us and working with the community that has brought this forward several times.
Thanks for that, Silverio. I did see Ryan and Jeremy both raise their hands. If you're still interested in offering information.
Yeah, because I'll kind of speak a little bit here. one thing to remember when it comes to the banned language and thing, you have to understand that if we're talking worst case scenario, this is just something for you to consider. If you're talking about banning something to the point where it's not allowed to be used at all, which is kind of what it sounds like. You need to understand too that the Graham Connor and the Ninth Circuit Court, as the chief kind of explained, they don't ban that necessarily because it's based on a reasonable officer perspective and the totality of circumstances. It's case law all the way up to the Supreme Court. So it may be a violation of policy, but that doesn't mean that it's unlawful, right? And then you have to look at it on the aspect of if it's a life or death situation, as a police officer, if I fail to do everything I can to save either my life or the life of someone else, and I base that on the fact that it was banned, how am I going to feel as an officer that I wasn't able to stop it? Because my policy says that I could be violated for that when it's justifiable under Supreme Court and Ninth Circuit Court and Circuit Court and city ordinance. That's just something to consider too, because we're talking about, these are life or death situations we're talking about, right? When it comes down to that. So it's just something to consider when you're thinking about the language of this and what we're talking about, we're not allowed to use anymore. You have to consider that.
One of the things I think, how is my connectivity now?
Much
is it a little better? Okay, perfect. Thank you for the patience. One of the things I think, Silver, that we can really drill down on us. I think there's a way. I think there's a way to build language and a culture around this not being a part of our practice. Well, I guess let me back this up. Again, it goes back to my comment I made about the word banned. We throw the word banned around a lot, and I think banned has meant a variety of different things in different departments. I know of no police department that has written a policy that specifically says you under no circumstances are you allowed to use the carotid restraint, and the use of that carotid restraint, regardless of the circumstance, results in disciplinary action or misconduct. And so, certainly not in Oregon, not in the state of Oregon. So it would be interesting maybe to get some examples of other jurisdictions of how they've approached wanting to move away from this technique that has been a part of the law enforcement culture for a long time, that has been misapplied and quite frankly has been used in a situation where lethal force is not justified in an attempt to subdue somebody or quote unquote put somebody to sleep, that has gone very awry. And that's the piece that I would say is we have banned it as a technique that we would use for anything other than those most extreme circumstances. You will never see a Eugene police officer put his arm around somebody's neck who's out of control in an attempt to gain compliance for any reason. And if we need to write a policy that specifically outlines that concept, I think, that's kind of where we want to head for sure. But to take it to that next level, and again, I use this as an example, the banning of that is I know a part of what we've seen, but we also have other instances of use of force that have resulted in the death of individuals that have been unimproved or techniques. Like I said, we've run over people with cars. We've hit people in the heads with a variety of instruments. We've been on the ground wrestling, and officers have had rocks at their disposal that they've used as a weapon to try and stop the threat. So there's a lot of those that kind of fall in that category of things that might come into play based on Supreme Court rulings and the Graham factors of the totality of the circumstance that we don't specifically outright ban. But I think there's a way to get to yes on this. I want to be careful about kind of the language around banned and making sure that we're just real thoughtful about how we use that language.
If I could suggest something that might move us along then, Silverio and anyone else who's interested in participating in this discussion, I think it might be worthwhile to engage the city attorney and see if we can come up with a form of words between EPD, the city attorney, and committee members that gets to the place where committee members wish to be, whilst at the same time recognizing that if somebody is in a fight for their life or a fight in order to protect someone else's life, that prohibiting them from using any particular restraint or type of force could be destructive or detrimental to preventing the loss of life.
As I appreciate that, and with all due respect, I would definitely consider that if it was something that was brought forward by a committee member. But being that it's a membership discussion, I don't feel as though the language necessarily has to be that you're in trouble if it doesn't, if you do have this use. And I that was never implied, Chief. And I did have, I searched high and low for the Los Angeles Police Department's use and their policy number regarding that. You know, I feel as though personally, we shouldn't be hung up on this being used as a tool in the toolbox. I had to leave early the EPD committee meeting that we had where Senator Manning joined us. Senator Manning is somebody who I think is on the term banned side of the conversation, and I definitely think it's something that we should start to look at. I want to say that I appreciate the fact that Sergeant Williams was already looking at some of the language, and that we were hopefully going to have some of that feedback on Thursday. So without having any sort of repercussions that take place on an officer, I understand completely what you're saying with that, but I don't think that was ever any kind of suggestion on our part. I think it's definitely just the use of any sort of chokeholds or sleeper holds or things that's going to cut off airways.
Yeah. I think there's a strong desire to get you to yes on this, Silver. I really do. I mean, I can't say that with any more sincerity. You know, I recognize that the carotid restraint nationally has been front and center with respect to how it was applied and the circumstances it was applied and the horrendous outcomes that it produced. So I just as much as we can connect over Zoom on this, I want you to know I want to get us to yes on something like this, because I do think it's a just and reliable direction to go.
I felt that. I appreciate that.
Okay, I'd like to, sorry, go ahead, Abdul Rahman. And then I'd like to move the discussion on to the next item. We've spent a substantial amount of time on this one.
Okay, this is not going to be long, but I wanted to share it with Chief Skinner and Sergeant Maloney in particular. I want their input. We know the police usually are trained to act against violence, and they have to be prepared because their lives are also on the issues. When the police is called for to deal with an issue or a matter, the biggest fear is when you find the other side is armed. I wonder how the police feels if the other side was unarmed altogether, which means this could be a national issue, not in the scope of this committee or the ad hoc committee. But as we are here to make presentation or to make suggestions or to give ideas to help the police want to save their lives as well as the other side's lives as well. But when they are armed, of course, their job becomes harder and harder. I wonder, why don't we address the issue of disarming the whole country, starting by the state of Oregon, for example, an arms-free state. And this, not every country in the world is armed. I know this is a big issue. Maybe this is not in the scope of this committee, but I just wanted to bring it in. And how does the police feel if they were dealing with people most likely to be unarmed? It would be a different story. I believe so. But I'd like to hear from Chief Skinner and possibly also from Sergeant Maloney. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that comment. We certainly the way this works, and you know, you always wish you could have the experiential opportunity to. Well, we all feel like we wish each other could have our own experiences. Then we'd have a better sense of empathy and understanding for each other's issues, regardless of what those are. What I can tell you is that officers on a daily basis are responding to things with limited information. Sometimes we have information about weapons, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have a history with the person we're going to see, and we know that they have a propensity to be armed, or maybe they don't. And so with that limited information, we try to make the best decisions that we can. Certainly, if we had a sense that weapons were not involved, it does adjust our approach significantly, because we know that there's probably not an imminent threat of serious physical injury or death to us as we arrive on scene. And so we have an opportunity to take a little bit of a different approach and maybe have some different tactics. When we know that there's weapons present, that means like we have to keep our distance, or we have to. A great example of is recently, and unfortunately, we have situations where we have somebody that's in a house that we know is armed. The way we approach that is completely different than somebody that we know is and that weapons aren't involved. What I would say is that in each situation, what we try to do is understand from an officer's perception whether there's the motivation and the means and the intent on the individual to do the officer harm, or somebody else to do somebody else harm, and that will shape our response. For instance, a person with a knife who's standing at the end of a hallway or a room that's holding it to their own throat and not moving is a completely different scenario than somebody with a knife or a gun that maybe is doing something that is perceived as officers as being aggressive. And so those responses could be different depending on that. And we've resolved an awful lot of those with less lethal technology. This is a point you bring up is a national issue. We have other countries that firearms are not the issue. It's more edged weapons. Like if you go over to some of our other Western countries where firearms are not as prevalent, that the weapon of choice is edged weapons or knives, and that provides a challenge for those folks there. We as chiefs constantly talk about the types of firearms that we're seeing in circulation. I've got my own personal views that I'd be happy to share with you at some point about the types of firearms that we're seeing in our society, and maybe more importantly, the capacity of the magazines and the rounds that people are carrying. I will tell you that I'm a little bit of an outlier with my fairly left-leaning views on that, but you're right. It's a national issue, and one that we're not going to be able to tackle around disarming a state or even disarming a city. I do think there's some things, and I know I'm being long-winded, I do think there's some things that this city council can do around some things that we've seen recently around open carry of firearms and protests. While Oregon is an open carry state and allows for that now, I do think that there's maybe some things we can do locally that would prohibit, in some cases, the open carry unless you had a legitimate concealed carry license. And when you do stuff like that, it's the first step in making sure that when people come together and there's potential conflict, that you don't have the volume of weapons there that only takes one negligent act to change the landscape and the face of a community. So I think there's maybe a little bit of work we can do there.
Thank you very much for that, Chief. So I'm going to move us along now to the second issue that Guadalupe raised, which was around de-escalation and mental health. and how, I believe it was how officers are trained and how they are able to assess whether somebody is undergoing a mental health crisis. Is that an accurate summary of what you said, Guadalupe?
Yeah, it is. I'm just kind of wondering also, added to that, is every officer prepared to know how to de-escalate around those different issues? Is there a special team that's brought in who has the skills and the knowledge around mental health and how to de-escalate a situation with individuals that are dealing with mental health issues? I'm just kind of curious as to how they deal with that.
Yeah, I think Sergeant Maloney is going to be probably best equipped to do this. I will say, as just a preface to that, is that we try in our training curriculum to build in opportunities for all of those trainings to occur, Guadalupe. Not only de-escalation training, but also getting crisis intervention training, tactical communications, and bringing in mental health professionals, and actually some individuals that are suffering from mental illness to come in and talk specifically about their experiences, and helping officers get inoculated to for instance, how a person with schizophrenia perceives certain things, much like we try to do with cultural competency around different cultures and the way they perceive authority, and kind of how we go into those situations and want to be mindful and sensitive to that. So Ryan, why don't you give us kind of a overview of some of the trainings that we try to undergo annually or every other year?
Yeah, so Chief kind of discussed it a little bit and touched on the topics. The term de-escalation, while it's defined in our policies and it's defined in a lot of different aspects, it really brings in all those critical incidences and communication skills. And so we've been training for years on making ourselves better, right? So our first line of defense as officers, as well as just citizens, is our voice, right? Our verbal communication, our ability to kind of perceive what's going on and talk to people. Every single new recruit when they get in here immediately starts with de-escalation when it comes to, that's like one of our first steps when it comes to all of our use of force training and that kind of stuff. Annually, I want to say, I did the numbers a while ago, so don't quote me on this, I'm still trying to remember, but they get anywhere from like 25 to 35 hours a year with various force training that doesn't even have anything to do with firearms, just with hands-on physical stuff and communication skills. Every single scenario that we build in for our officers to do for scenario-based training has the component for de-escalation as a performance objective, which is addressed at every single debrief after those scenarios. If we're not happy with the way that went, or if they didn't utilize those opportunities to de-escalate, we reset the scenario, we rerun it, and we have them go through it in a more successful manner and using their communication. Those certifications that we give officers, for example, the CIT class we go officers, that's a week. And I've been through that twice actually, just because it's only necessarily required once, but officers will go through it sometimes a couple times. The panel that we have that come in, they're citizens from the community that have established mental health issues and have had contacts with police, and they want to discuss those with the officers in the room. And it's basically, it's a listening panel for our officers to really understand the plight of what's going on. And it's really an eye-opener for a lot of officers, which is great, because they get to learn how to communicate with people, and they get to understand that sometimes maybe they're not going to be able to communicate on those standard platforms like we expect from normal communication and talking to people. So those things, coupled by our scenarios that are built in based on actual events that we see on the street and actual events that occur, to better our officers and give them more of a Rolodex and things to choose from, and to just flat out slow the situation down. When officers show up on scene, that's really one of the first things we tell them to look for. If there's an opportunity to slow things down, take a bigger picture of what's going on, see if they can perceive anything that's actually a threat or maybe not a threat, depending on the information they get, and open lines of communication first and foremost. It usually helps resolve situations much better, and then you can see what you're there, what options and offers you can hand the public or whoever's there to help them through the situation they're in. So it's kind of a complicated thing to discuss in a really short forum like this, but it's an ongoing thing that it touches on every single bit of our force training when it comes to defensive tactics. And we reiterate it continuously in our in-service trainings over and over again.
And I guess just a response to that, I appreciate what you're saying and the information you're sharing, just as the chief has, but I guess I just want to make sure that we also remind each other that what you're saying and what you're doing and the areas you're covering, the community doesn't see it in the same way. The reaction to the community is that folks are not doing a good job of de-escalating. And part of that comes from the fact that they're watching the evening news and the situation has ended or has not been de-escalated in a way that they feel could have, not knowing the whole story. I get that. We can make a whole lot of judgments and assumptions about each other, not having the whole story. But it really matters, anyway, from where I'm at in the community and what I'm hearing, especially in this moment in time, the community does not see things the same way. The community is very distrusting and does not really always believe that the police are really well prepared or that they've done everything that they could to de-escalate. What they see is a reaction or a response from the police department that includes a lot of police officers and a lot of cars and some SWAT team. And the outcome is all that they really know. And so part of that is, you know, I hear what you're saying and I appreciate it. And it's not that I don't believe that folks aren't doing the best they can considering the tough job police officers have. But I also worry that in the community, you know, we've lost so much ground around trusting the police or really even understanding. How is it that the regular person in the community would even know what you're saying or know about the training that you do unless they happen to be part of a committee or inquire? They're not going to do that. So I guess I just want to throw that out because I think it's another really important piece of the work that we as a committee and the things we want to move forward and the recommendations we want to make. You know, we're doing that as a group of individuals who are somewhat connected. But for the community to really see it and understand it and trust it in the same way, there's a whole piece of work that has to be done to build that. And I don't even know where we start. But you know, I just want to throw that out.
I appreciate that comment. And one of the things that has occurred to me when I got here in the way of building that trust or giving people some exposure to whether it's the training curriculum or the decision-making process or all of those things. Because at Guadalupe, I think you're right, is, you know, we all look at, we see a threshold event and we all look at it through kind of our own lens. Some of us are maybe more informed, some of us are less, but all we know is what we know. And sometimes it doesn't feel very good. And we know that. One of the things that I really have some energy around, and obviously with COVID, it makes it difficult, is resurrecting the Citizens Police Academy that allows citizens to come in and actually see the training and experience the training, be a part of that, and actually give feedback about how the training is being conducted and how they've perceived the training and whether there's gaps in our training. Really have an opportunity to experience a variety of things throughout the police culture in kind of a cohort situation with a bunch of other like-minded people that really just want to experience that as an opportunity to build a greater depth and baseline with people so that when they see things, they can think back on their own experience and say, you know what, I saw this so-and-so got arrested for, say, drug use. I remember when this detective came in and talked to us about the issue around controlled substance and how it's being used or trafficked in Eugene. I mean, there's so many of those things that can be valuable. And so I do think that one of the outcomes should be, and one that I've already kind of got in motion, is how, you know, what is the mechanism to get people in this community more connected with the inner workings of this police department? And one way to do that is to invite them in and say, let's experience this together. in kind of a safe, equitable, and inclusive environment. And I think that would help. I don't think that's the answer. I think it's one piece of many that would start to help a little bit.
Okay, thank you for that, Chief. I think Marty had his hand raised.
Yeah, so these conversations have brought up two areas that I'd like to talk to. One is about de-escalation. And so two things. One is I talked to people that worked on Cahoots, and they talked about when they approach somebody in a mental health crisis, they arrive in a van and they are wearing casual clothing, and they're not armed. And that gives them an advantage right at the door over when police arrive. Because just arriving in a patrol car and coming in armored and armed can freak somebody out who's already in a mental health situation. So no matter how well trained that person is, bottom line is you still have a gun and you're still a cop. And if people have their predisposition about that, it plays into it. So while I applaud your intent to have more transparency and more connection with the community, it might be another vision that we fund and invest in our mental health services to the degree where we can always have somebody who's not EPD be the first responder in those situations. If it's not about apprehending somebody for a crime, and then that first responder can be the one to call in EPD as a second responder if necessary. That feels to me like it could be a win-win because it addresses the community around their distrust, basically, and around their feeling that, that's not what they want. They don't want the police responding in that situation, because I've heard people on the streets tell me they won't even call Cahoots because they might end up getting the police. And it also takes more off your plate, which I often hear that you're holding way too much and you're being asked to do everything and be a fix-all. You're the bottom line for everything. So it would take that off of you. And
Hi, Marty, 30 seconds.
okay, thanks. So the second thing was about gun control. We were talking about gun control. And so I wanted to put that back on you, on the EPD. Are you participating in the 1033 Department of Defense military surplus program? And have you already acquired military equipment through that program? That's another concern of mine, is being over militarized.
Yeah, no, I get you, Marty. First of all, let me tell you, I couldn't agree with you more about the first half of this conversation. If anybody's listened to anything that I've said, either locally or nationwide, because I've been on, because of Cahoots, I've been on a dog and pony show for, months now on this thing. And my mantra has always been behavioral health first responders need to respond to behavioral health issues, and law enforcement are not behavioral health first responders. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think there's a tremendous opportunity through the Community Safety Initiative to look at how we can adjust some funding, the direction of some of the funding to go towards a more robust behavioral health first response for people. And that's, I couldn't be more supportive of that. And you'll see me actually give up resources if that's a way we can get, because that's a win for us, is if we can get the right resource to the right need. And law enforcement isn't the right resource for all these needs, 100%. So you're singing my song here. On the back half of that, the history of military surplus has been around a long time. I mean, agencies struggling with budgets have always seen that as a way to grab pieces of equipment that they felt like they need. I couldn't tell you when the last time was that we even engaged in that process. I think, quite honestly, we've got some old, beat up Humvee vehicle sitting in the yard somewhere that never gets used. But I honestly don't, in my time here, I don't remember being involved in any kind of acquisition of military surplus equipment. So yeah, it's not high on my priority list, quite honestly. Most of the stuff is junk, and actually costs us more to maintain than it is. And so I can assure you that military surplus is not going to be is not a strategy with this chief.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Chief Skinner. The next item I had on my list was from Marty again, and that was about the duty to intercede. And that is, I believe, the last item that members raised. So before we turn to that, if there are any other issues that people would like to have discussed here, then please raise them now so that I've got them lined up. Otherwise, we will move on to the discussion on the duty to intercede, Marty. Silverio?
Just 2 points I wanted to clear up. Graham v. Connor was brought up several times, so I shared that in the chat. And I know that the chief has heard from Guadalupe and from me and from several other people that, you know, we're here because we want to voice what we've heard from the community. And I know that that's important to you. And I know that when we sat at the table that you have stated that part of what we're also looking for from the police department in this 21st century policing is to have more engagement. And that's a big component to this. So, you know, we can be more engaged if we don't feel like we're not safe in any given situation. So just wanted to reiterate that. And again, that piece is in the chat box there.
Okay, thank you for that, Silverio. Marty, if you'd like to talk about the duty to intercede.
Okay, yeah. So we have a policy in place, policy 800.1.2, duty to intercede. Any officer who observes another officer using force that's clearly beyond that which is objectively reasonable under the circumstances shall, when in a position to do so, intercede to prevent the use of such excessive force. Officers witnessing excessive force will also report these observations to a supervisor immediately. So I just wanted to tighten that up a little bit and add things that I borrowed from other departments. And they are: reports shall be made to a supervisor in writing within 10 days of the occurrence, and shall be appended to all other reports of the incident. Officers shall not be subject to discipline or retaliation for intervening or for reporting excessive force or for failing to follow a directive that the officer reasonably believed to be excessive. And officers who fail to intercede to prevent excessive force when the evidence deems that the officer was in a position to do so will be subject to an allegation of misconduct. So yeah, this is a lot of what I was trying to do with the other proposals that I made, was to take something that's there and it has a good intention, but it just, it doesn't seem to have enough teeth. You know, it doesn't seem to follow through, especially on the protection against retaliation for those who do step up.
Okay, is there anyone else that would like to speak to the issues that Marty has raised? Any members of the committee have any views? Go ahead, Rick.
Well, I don't really have a view. I would just like to sort of reiterate what Marty's saying. And I know, you know, our department deals with those kind of issues as well. And it's a tough one. I know it's a tough one because you're dealing with the human element, and the human element is not logical. And a lot of these issues surrounding use of force, which I still believe at the end of all of this, it's going to boil down to the relationship between the community and the officers. And I know we talk about it on our department, we talk about it DEI, and when you get to talking to people in the community, it's the same thing. And despite the fact that I don't see the end picture of the how they're reducing the violations for controlled substances and things like that. Little things like that can be part of the solution, but the huge thing is this communication and this relationship between the officers and the community. And that's why we have the issue with this topic here, use of force. And a lot of it has to do with perception and relationship.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rick. If anybody else has anything further to say on the discussion, I was about to hand it over to you, Chief Skinner. I was going to ask committee members first, but if nobody else has anything to say, then please go ahead, Chief Skinner.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this is a great opportunity to take that policy to the next level. I really like some of the language that you have, Marty, that just really gives us an opportunity with policy language to actually shape culture change. And when you do something, when you go down the path of a policy and you actually make it a little bit more prescriptive and much more detailed, and you actually say, an officer that is interceded is not going to be subject to these things, it starts to shape culture. And one of the things that we have to continually fight against is police culture and how police culture has evolved. And anytime you're in a team environment where you have to count on each other sometimes in life or death situations, and yet you're still asking them to bring these things forward, which sometimes could be detrimental to the team environment. That's about trying to create a healthy culture that makes that okay to do that still preserves the team. And so one of the things that I pay attention to, especially when we look at our internal affairs investigations, is of the investigations we're doing, how many of them are generated internally, which means how many cops do we have, telling on other cops. And that's a good sign of an organization that feels okay, that they can raise their hand and say, I don't like what I saw, and I'm gonna have, and so needs to be held accountable. But just from a culture perspective, I think we have to constantly be pushing to change that culture, and we can do that through policy, we can do that through leadership, we can do that through instances where these things happen, and oh, by the way, it worked out because it was the right thing, and that somebody wasn't retaliated against, and it encourages other people to step in that space and be courageous enough to say something when they see something that just isn't right. So I think we all want to lean in on that, and I think this is a good example of how we can do that by some adjustments to that policy.
Okay, thank you very much. We have around 20 minutes left, and the next sort of step is to identify which areas we want to be turning into motions. Marty's done a lot of that work, so thank you for that, Marty. But in terms of the subject areas that we've been through, this is my list. If anyone has captured any others, please let me know. So there's tasers, spit hoods, de-escalation around mental health, funding in terms of mental health first responders, the 1033 program, and finding a form of words for what we're currently calling the chokeholds, arm bars, and carotid restraints ban. So those are the issues, and also the duty to intercede. So if there's anything that I've missed off of that list, please let me know. Was that a hand, Silva?
It is. It's just a clarification. I know that the armbar is something that we're not really clear on always. The armbar not being the one that's used as a hold that is utilized to apply pressure when a person is being detained with their arm at the back or elevated with their arms at the back. Just to make sure that that's not something that we've had this discussion several times, and mainly we're talking about any kind of stranglehold that has to deal with a blockage of airways.
Okay, I was just going on the language that you've used on previous occasions, but your specific concern is around anything that involves the obstruction of the airway or potential constriction of the airway.
In some instances, the armbar was discussed as a stranglehold.
Right, chokeholds, strangleholds, and arm bars. Yeah. So I will make a note on that. And then Marty, I believe you also had your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to ask the other committee members here. Are people interested in using a spreadsheet that is broken down by police policy number, and that has what we see as a problem, what we propose changing, how that's going to help, categories in there, and then I guess the model would be everybody would receive a copy, edit their own, send theirs back up to CAS. How do people feel about that?
I'm a hands-on person, so yes.
I think you have a consensus there, Marty. Is this a spreadsheet you've sent to me before, or is this the one that you've been working on in the meanwhile? Okay, so yeah, I would be very happy to, if you send that to me, I'll circulate it to committee members. They can make their comments. I will compile those and have them ready for the next subcommittee meeting. We're about 15 minutes from the end. I don't know if members have any other issues they would like to raise or anything they would like to hit on. Silveria?
Yeah, step up, step back. This will be my last thing. So these are not the full breadth of conversations that we're going to have around use of force. Is that correct? We will have other conversations.
Yeah, the idea was that we would use this as a kind of filtering mechanism. So out of all of the things that are on the table, we would use those to highlight the things that are the highest priority for members. There is nothing stopping anybody in the intervening period from putting together a motion on their own. But it was simply because at the last meeting, people felt that they weren't able to have the in-depth discussions with the subject matter experts to be able to, they were saying, well, there's something not quite right with community oversight. We need to fix it. And then it was only in the discussion of those motions that were presented that people did on their own research that it became clear, well, this thing needs moving and that thing needs changing and this other thing is immovable. So the reason for structuring the subcommittees like this is to ensure that people can have those discussions in depth with the experts, having had the initial, sort of broader educational piece in the full committee. You're absolutely empowered to work on any other areas, to email myself or anyone at EPD, although I do ask you include me and Kevin in the loop. To ask questions and to put together the motions that you'd like circulated. The only real restriction would be whenever we do end up scheduling the next subcommittee meeting, it would be great if we could receive the documents in time beforehand so that we can circulate them out to the whole group. So yeah, this is by no means the limit of the discussion. This is just about the areas that the committee has most concern about.
So does that mean that we're going to present this information to the larger committee? Is that true, Cause?
In a sense. So in the meeting,
report back.
Yeah. I mean, it would be possible if committee members wanted to. This isn't something we did with the community oversight, but there could be a short report. And if the committee wanted to nominate somebody to write up that report and then could vote on whether or not they wanted to send it to the full committee at the next meeting, that's a fairly standard practice with subcommittees. But the main product of this two-committee process was intended to be the motions, and then the kind of contextualizing information. And I think it might be useful at this point to briefly share something that that Kevin has put together. So this is based on a motion that was passed at the last meeting, and the words are not those of the committee. This is just a kind of sample document to give a sense of maybe what a recommendation in the final report might end up looking like. So as you can see here, this was the cards that were suggested by the Community Oversight Subcommittee, and then the contextual information here. What is the problem, and how do you think it will address it? Talks about the applicable policy, talks about the applicable Campaign Zero and 21st Century Policing recommendations. And then we would look at whether there were any federal, in this case, I don't think there will be, which is why we chose it. It's nice and simple. So that's kind of the end product that we're aiming for at the end of this process. And I thought it was important to share with everyone for clarity. And the way that we would plan to get there would be that motions would be put forward by the subcommittee, voted on, people would suggest any amendments that they might want to bring. And then those would go to the full committee. The full committee would then have the opportunity to discuss them and vote on them. And anything that was passed by a vote of that of the full committee would be included in the final report.
Great, thank you. I just wasn't sure.
Okay. So if there are no other items that people would like to discuss, we do have 10 minutes left or 12 minutes left, but there is the possibility of, I would need a motion to adjourn, but there is the possibility of adjourning a few minutes early if that's what members wished to do, or otherwise bring.
Yes,
go ahead.
Sorry, Erica has her hand up.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Erica.
Good evening. First, to apologize because I arrived late for things that I couldn't control. But something that I would like to talk before we move is that I would like to know, because we're trying to, limit the use of deadly force. So I'm kind of interested to hear what is going to happen with the 1033 military surplus program. If we're leading this initiative in a way to limit police brutality, I would like to know what is going to happen with the surplus program they have, because EPD has acquired and continue to acquire this kind of equipment, military equipment. And we know that through this program, so the studies have shown that the more militarized the field becomes, with equipment and weapons, and this kind of facilitates this kind of brutality. So I would like to know, that is a problem, right? Because if we're trying to reduce this kind of situations, but our police department keeps continuing getting all this kind of equipment. So I see it as a problem. So I would like to hear how we are going to solve, or what is the proposal. For example, I would like to propose that all that surplus is destroyed or is done something, but if there is a surplus, it's clearly that we don't need it. I think what we need is more to invest in training our people that is going to be protecting our communities in the escalation, because I feel that if that is the goal, I don't understand why do we need to have this military equipment surplus. So I would like to hear something about that. Thank you.
Sure. We did cover this before you joined the meeting, but Chief Skinner, please go ahead.
Sure, happy to address that. So to my knowledge, we've not acquired any military surplus equipment since my arrival, and we don't participate in the program right now. Like I said before, I think years ago they acquired a couple of vehicles. Mostly, I think there's at least one. And Ryan, you might know. I think there's one Humvee that's kind of a broken down vehicle that's sitting in a yard somewhere. But to my knowledge, there's been no acquisition of military surplus in the almost 3 years that I've been here, and no plans for participating in that program as we move into the future.
Sorry, Sergeant Maloney, if you want to speak to the rest of that question.
Yeah, I was just reiterating what the chief said. I agree with that as well. And as far as the Humvee that was allocated years ago, it's basically been placed out of service, and it hasn't been used based on the fact that it's not even really functional equipment, and two, there's just no need for it based on what the other equipment we have.
Okay, we have, so Erica, if you want to respond to that, and then Silverio.
I'm just like wondering because, you know, during the last May and during the last movement that happened during last summer, you know, like police responded with a lot of different strategies and equipment that is military. Some of them we know that we shouldn't be using. It has been told, but, you know, Eugene Police Department did use this against the citizens. So that's why, like, even if you have not acquired in the last 3 years, we know that there is this surplus that shouldn't be being used against the citizens. So my question is, like, what are we going to do with this? Because if, like, the intention and the goal is
30 seconds, please.
I don't think we need to have that surplus. And also, I would like to like point out the fact that, you know, when a person is murdered by police brutality, like the people, the family, takes a long time. And for what I hear, is very dehumanizing the process, that the family of the people that had been died, like they don't receive the information, you know, specifically of people of color that had been unfortunately be murdered in the last couple of years. I would like to hear, like,
hey, Eric,
what are the
time's up. Thank you.
that are going to happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Silverio, is it the same thing you put in the chat?
Just briefly, yeah. So I know that we have the use of the Bearcats that was used in the May protest. I think that's what Erica was referring to. So I'm sure that was purchased before you came on, Chief, but isn't that considered a militarized vehicle? And wasn't that purchased under that program?
I don't think it was purchased under the program. The program is specifically military surplus that's already been in the military arsenal, and that is being cycled out and basically given to law enforcement. Those pieces of equipment are actually purchased by law enforcement, and they're actually built specifically for law enforcement use from a company called Lenco. Now, having said that, Lenco may also do military vehicles, but those are vehicles that we have on that replacement cycle and use for a variety of special circumstances. But the original Bearcat that we have that you see, I don't think that was a military surplus vehicle. Quite honestly, it's lasted way too long to be a military surplus vehicle. That thing would have broken down a year after we would have gotten it.
So that wasn't classified as militarized. So there is an additional Humvee that you mentioned.
Right. I think we ended up with a Humvee that was in service with the military. They were getting rid of it, and we thought for whatever reason years ago that it would be a good idea for us to have it. And as Sergeant Maloney pointed out, maybe it was in service at one point, but hasn't been for years and years and years. So while we have equipment that looks very, very militaristic, we don't want to confuse that with it being surplus military equipment that came to us through this particular program.
I can appreciate that. Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, and then there was the issue from Erica. We just have 5 more minutes left about getting information to families of individuals who are deceased. If you could just speak briefly to that.
Real quick, and we're seeing that right now. As you know, real quick, the piece of this that really is disjointed for us in the state is Senate Bill 111, which mandates that Lane County have a officer-involved shooting or deadly force protocol by which the district attorney's office has a team of independent investigators investigate the shooting criminally, and then the district attorney's office is the one that oversees that investigation and is in charge of the release of information. I will tell you that in every situation, the district attorney and that team has a liaison with the family. And so whether we hear about it or not, or whether there's a misunderstanding or not, there is somebody that is assigned to the family to be able to connect with them and give them as much information as reasonably can be expected to give them that doesn't compromise that investigation. But all of that happens through the umbrella and the oversight of the district attorney's office, because it is an ongoing criminal investigation. So even if EPD wanted to reach out to the family, it would not be appropriate for us to do that and reveal information about the criminal investigation. Because if there is ever a day where we have an officer that does something that is criminal in nature that we want to prosecute them for, we want to make sure that that investigation is as airtight as possible, just like we would want in any case. And so we're really, really careful about not doing anything that's going to compromise that investigation.
Okay, Chief Skinner, just a quick question in the chat from Marty asking whether the liaison is a sworn officer.
The liaison, that's a good question, because it's not somebody from EPD. My guess is yes, Marty. And I'm trying to think in this most recent one, if it was an investigator that is connected with the family. And I think the answer to that is yes.
Okay, we have 3 minutes. So if anyone has any final comments, please go ahead and make them now. Otherwise, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. And if there are any further actions that members would like me to take, please email me.
So I do want to move to adjourn, but I also want to kind of discuss the fact that we've had 2 meetings now since the shooting here. And I know that we're prone to jump to conclusions, and that there's been a lot of information that's not been really kind of shared with the public. But I think at some point we need to start having a conversation about the recent shooting. And I'm grateful that that the person who's involved was not killed. And I do need to say that I continue to hear about Black lives being killed across the nation, and it just continues to be a source of not just sadness but terror. That at some point as adults we need to have a discussion about, because this is something that is very important. So I do want to make that statement, and I'm hoping that we can have a more open conversation about that. I know that. Go ahead, Chief.
I was just going to give you a little bit of piece of information that might help with you. I fully expect the district attorney's office to be at a place where she's ready to release all of the information on next Monday, which is 14 days from the date of the incident, which in many cases is actually very, very fast for a complex criminal investigation. I share levels of frustration around that 2-week waiting period and kind of this vacuum of information that occurs. And I constantly work to try and change that. And so that's kind of going to be an ongoing process for us. But in the way of having conversation around this, I think after next Monday, you'll have a volume of content that I think can shape that conversation.
If you would be willing to be at that table when we have a more open conversation about what took place, I would appreciate it. And I would like to start to have that discussion.
Happy to be there, and that trigger where Patty releases all that information kind of frees me up a little bit. Nothing's more frustrating than having me at the table and just hearing from me say, I can't discuss that or I can't release that. And I want to be value added. And so it helps once that information comes out.
Okay. Is there anything else from anybody? Erica, I thought you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I am raising my hand. So I just wanted to point out, I want to take the opportunity that I have a Chief Skinner in the meeting. And I wanted to point out that police brutality is not just, like what is happening physically, it's also mentally, you know? And I'm talking about specifically the way the Latino indigenous mural was targeted and the way it was talked and the way like the community was harassed and persecuted because of the mural. I think I want to tell you that we do not appreciate your words. We do not appreciate you censoring the voice of the community by using your power and using the media and silencing in a way that the community never had the opportunity to release their press release or any of the photos or video that was made to show to the people like the story behind the mural. And all that was censored by you, Chief Skinner. And I want you to know that silencing our community is another type of brutality we're suffering. And the fact that the mural has been destroyed and it was empowered by your voice. And I want you to know that that is also police brutality. Maybe you haven't touched us, maybe we have not been brutalized, but the fact that a mural that was created with love, that was accused of being divisive, I just want you to know that the division, we didn't do it. The division is historical, and the role of police against BIPOC people, especially indigenous peoples and people of color, is a historical thing. We didn't write Manifest Destiny. We just created a mural that show what is happening in here. And the same way that Black Lives Matter, and in the whole country, we can see that is happening. But when we come back home and come to Lane County, and we know that in here, there is 2 people from our community that were killed, and the news, they say that it was okay. I'm talking about Charlie Renderos and Lely Borio Rodriguez because they are part of our community. And you and your voice, dehumanizing a person that the whole community is trying to humanize, that is brutality too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, Erica. We are over time, so we will need either a motion to extend or a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Can I get a second?
I second.
Okay, Rick, second. Well, thank you everyone for your time. This is a complex area. It takes a lot of thought. So I really appreciate you putting the time and effort in both tonight and beforehand. Thank you to Cindy, to Ryan, and to Chief Skinner for making themselves available and answering these questions in detail. Of course, thank you to Kevin and Jeremy, my colleagues behind the scenes that have made all of this possible. So in terms of next steps, you are free to write whatever motions you so choose. I will circulate the list of issues that were identified as priorities tomorrow or the day after. And there's nothing wrong with several members deciding to write their own motions. And please feel free to share that with us. We can help to go through what is or is not within the policy, and make sure that there's the legal and the policy eye on it before the next meeting. So again, thank you all for your time. Please let us know if there's anything else we can do for you. And I hope you have a great evening. Thank you very much.